Are you on preview mode or have you gone live?
No, I'm now live. Okay.
Brilliant. Okay, go for it. Speak to you soon. Bye.
Can you see my slides?
No, I can only see you.
Can you see this?
Have a PowerPoint window on top.
Yeah, it's on top.
Oh. Why can't I see it then? But I am seeing you with a lag, so... Have you got your PowerPoint in slideshow mode?
I've just got the placeholder up.
So when you did your screen sharing, did you choose the application window share option, or did you go for entire screen?
No, when you say entire screen, you mean in live stream?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just in the corner. Yeah.
Have you got the little sign on that says restream is sharing a window? There's a little tag usually at the bottom of your screen to remind you on top.
Say that again. Sorry.
You normally have a little, when you're sharing your screen, you usually have a little message that says restream.io is sharing a window.
No, it doesn't say that. No.
You're not sharing a window, so...
Okay, I can just... Go on.
Can you touch... Have you got the icons for sharing the window, or do you need to disconnect and reconnect?
No, well, the icon's there, but it's not... It's one of those things about pressing on it. Look, would it be better if I just go without the overheads? I can do that, you know. Or if you think... Yeah, well, I mean...
You can do it at the PowerPoint, or you can do it or within the middle of this.
I'll go without the PowerPoint because I think it's going to take a while otherwise. Yeah, I'm happy doing that. So I'll just click the microphone off and get going. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay. Cheers. Bye bye. Welcome, folks. Thanks for logging in and for joining the Alternative University of the Air. And in joining us, you're supporting UCU's industrial action for greater equality at work and into casualisation, the catch-up in pay and protection of our pensions. So thanks for the solidarity. And remember, the good working conditions for all university staff are good learning conditions. Now, these sessions are badged as structural inequality in higher education. I'm certainly going to be discussing structural inequality today, but my focus on Grenfell has also got some resonance across higher education too. I was just going to point to a picture, actually. I should say the talk was supported by PowerPoints, either because of technical problems or because of my technical inadequacies, probably the latter. I can't get the PowerPoints up, so you're going to have to bear me waving my hands around, looking at my books and just speaking to you. So the link with HE is kind of this. If you recall the recent fire at the Cube student accommodation in Bolton 2 weeks ago today, actually, the tower block blazed, and unfortunately no students were severely injured, and of course no lives were lost. Now, in June 2017, just after the fire at Grenfell, local authorities across the country assessed some of the high-rise accommodation blocks in their areas to see if they had the same kind of cladding as was at Grenfell, cladding known as ACM. And in the wake of that kind of assessment, 436 such high-rises were found, and 53 of those were student accommodation. These had ACM cladding on. By the end of last month, that's 30 months after Grenfell, that cladding, that combustible cladding, the cladding which made the Grenfell fire so ferocious, that cladding remained in place on 318 high-rise blocks, including 18 student blocks. Even more worrying, I think, is that the Cube at Bolton wasn't one of these. It had something called HPL cladding, which hasn't even been investigated, but now appears to be a fire hazard. So one of the points I want to make today is that Grenfell is not just a thing that happened in the past, it's a hazard, it's a risk which remains with many of us, with all of us, in fact. Okay, let me kind of just recap the basic facts of what happened at Grenfell. The early hours of June 14th, 2017, a tower block in the west of London on the Lancaster West Estate, Grenfell Tower, housing 204 households, began to burn. And within minutes, certainly hours, the whole block was ablaze. The tower had recently been refurbished, and almost as an afterthought of that refurbishment, cladding was put on the outside of the building. The cladding panels happened to be highly flammable and were the cause of the fire being so ferocious. And in that fire, as a result of that fire, 72 people lost their lives. The 204 households in the tower were, of course, relocated, and also another 161 households who were located in and around the tower, but not in the tower itself, also had to be evacuated and relocated. So I want to talk about what happened today in kind of four unequal parts. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, okay? So I want to say something about the context for Grenfell Tower. Then I want to look at Grenfell in three ways: as a crime, as a source of social harm, and as a site of social murder. Yeah. So firstly, Grenfell Tower in context. There are a couple of key contextual points, I think, for us understanding Grenfell and why what happened at Grenfell Tower happened. The first one is to understand Grenfell in the context of searing and indeed increasing inequality. Now, not every year, but frequently, the governments of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland separately undertake an exercise where they determine multiple deprivation levels of poverty across the country. And they use indices of multiple deprivation to reach an overall indicator or measure of poverty or deprivation in particular areas. And they basically slice the country up into tenths. So you can go from the 10% poorest areas to the 10% richest areas. And they're collections of small areas. You can map them in different ways. Now, the measurement of around Grenfell Tower using the latest index of multiple deprivation tells us that the residents of Grenfell were amongst the 10% poorest in England at the time, right, and still are, in fact. Okay, so we're talking about an absolutely and relatively poor group of people, not every single individual, but that small area. By contrast, the area within which the tower stood, so Grenfell Tower sits within a local authority borough called the Royal Borough of Kenton and Chelsea. And that's the richest borough, in the richest 10%, in fact, in the richest 1%. It's the richest borough in England, okay, by the same token. So you've got a poor area, a very poor area, and a very rich area. And that also tells us that that borough, that local authority area, is the most unequal in England. So you've got the starkest area of inequality, and that's the context within which Grenfell Tower, the tower stood and the fire occurred. It's not just that it's the most unequal area in England, but it's also an area that's getting more unequal. So the local MP, Emma Dent-Coe, gathered together secondary data in the wake of the fire. If you want to see, she produced a report. If you want to see this report, put Emma Dent-Coe Grenfell inequality into Google and you'll find it. She found that since 2010 to 2017, the inequality in the borough was increasing. And in fact, as one indicator of that, she found that over that 7-year period, the life expectancy between the poorest 10% of the people and the richest 10% of the people had increased by 6 years. So that by 2017, the richest 10% of the people in that borough expected to live on average 22 years longer than the poorest people in the borough. And that's pretty stark and pretty glaring in a rich, industrialised economy such as is the UK. Now, alongside those that inequality, it's also argued, I think correctly, that in the borough relationships in the borough between the rich and poor were characterised by contempt. And in particular, I'm referring here to social housing tenants, such as those people who lived in Grenfell Tower and most of the estate around it, and the council, the Royal Borough of Kenton and Chelsea Council, and also the TMO, the Tenants Management Organisation. The TMO was the body set up by the council to manage social housing on its behalf in the borough. So it's kind of separate from, but had a close relationship to the council. And relationships between the residents, social housing residents in the borough, and the council and TMO have been described as relationships of contempt and relationships of hatred by commentators who know the area. Such was the kind of difficulties of the local residents in getting their voices heard by the council and the TMO, that in 2010 they formed something called the Grenfell Action Group. In other words, to collectively articulate the voices of the people in the tower, to have their concerns about living conditions and so on listened to. And the Grenfell Action Group began to blog, do many other things. It began to blog, and its blogs and its raising concerns became increasingly vociferous after 2014. And 2014 was when the refurbishment of the tower, essentially replacement of central heating and boiler systems, began to take place. And the residents were particularly concerned that the ways in which that refurbishment was being undertaken was making their tower block unsafe and in particular a fire hazard. And there's one very famous or infamous blog by the Grenfell Action Group in November 2016 called KCTMO, Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation. KCTMO playing with fire. Again, if you want to check this out, look it up on the, just stick Grenfell Action Group, KCTMO playing with fire into Grenfell and you'll find it. And that blog begins with an image of a tower block on fire and it starts off with these words. It's a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the KCTMO, and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety that they inflict upon their tenants and land and leaseholders. We believe the KCTMO are evil, unprincipled mini-mafia who've got no business to be charged with the responsibility of looking after the day-to-day management of large-scale social housing, and that their sordid collusion with the council is a recipe for a future major disaster. And in fact, what they go on to do in that blog is, in a sense, to foretell the fire, which was to take place tragically and take 72 lives 7 months later, 7 months after that blog was published. So they say in the last paragraph of that blog, the Grenfell Action Group predicts that it won't be long before the words of this blog will come back to haunt the KCTMO management. They can't say they haven't been warned. They were warned. So that's the context. Contempt, inequality. Now, the three things I want to talk about. Grenfell as a site of crime, Grenfell as a source of social harm, and Grenfell as a site of social murder. So we can talk about Grenfell as a site of crime firstly in several ways. Now, the first thing to say about Grenfell in terms of crime is that since the fire, there have been a whole series of arrests, prosecutions and convictions related to the fire. These have been convictions of what I would call the usual suspects. They've mostly been poor, marginalised, working class people, people of colour, living in and around the area who've been convicted of fraud in relation to what happened, in relation to Grenfell Tower. They've mostly claimed that they lost things they didn't lose, or that they were living in the tower when they never lived there. Many of these people are described in newspaper reports as being homeless. They're also described, sadly, as and pejoratively as being illegal immigrants. Their countries of origin include Jamaica, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, Tunisia, the UAE, Portugal, Bangladesh, the Ivory Coast, Grenada. In other words, they're not white British working class people, and I think that's of some relevance. Almost all of them, well, in fact, all of them with one exception in the first instance, received prison sentences. The sentences ranged from 12 weeks, but were mostly much higher than that. The highest was 6 years. The one exception to this kind of, the rounding up of the marginalised suspects was a middle-class woman, Jenny McDonough. She received 5.5 years in prison. Jenny McDonough was the finance officer in the council, and she embezzled £62,500 out of the fund that had been generated for survivors. And other offences when she was formerly employed in the NHS were taken into account. But the point I'm making is the criminal justice system works very quickly. The first conviction was within weeks of the fire to hoover up the usual suspects. Secondly, in terms of crime, also discussed in the wake of the fire was the use of something called the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act. And this was a law brought in the UK in 2008 to allow the more effective prosecution of large and complex organisations, which hadn't been possible under English and Welsh law prior to that date. No large organisation had ever been successfully prosecuted for manslaughter. This law was supposed to make that possible. So very soon after the fire, the Metropolitan Police announced that it was investigating possible charges against the council, against the TMO, and against Ryden, which was the main contractor involved in the refurbishment of the tower, but also about 8 other companies who are working with Ryden. There are in fact about 60 other companies involved in the refurbishment. Now, the first thing to say is that as the police gather evidence in relation to charges under the Act, that we shouldn't hold our breath. They'll look for evidence. They may pass out to the CPS. Given how long these kind of cases take, we might expect charges to be laid 2022, 2023, but it may be much further down the line than that, if charges are laid at all. The second thing to say is that since the Act came into force in 2008, it's been used about 30 times. There have been 26 successful convictions. None of those have been against a large organisation for which the law was designed. They've all been against, with one exception, which is a medium-sized organisation, all been against very small organisations, which in fact could have been successfully prosecuted for manslaughter prior to the passage of this Act. If there are successful prosecutions, the only sanctions are fines. Individuals are explicitly removed from the remit of this Act. Thirdly, there could be prosecutions under what's known as gross negligence manslaughter against senior individuals in these key organisations, the council, the tenants management organisation, and perhaps some of the leading contractors. The Metropolitan Police have said that they've conducted 13 interviews under caution to this point in relation to possible charges. They haven't said who these interviews were with. Again, it's a very unlikely and high legal bar to be passed that any of these senior, like chief executive of the council, for example, any of the senior officers will be successfully prosecuted. You may recall in the news yesterday, hearing that David Duckenfield, the senior police officer on duty at the time of the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, he was acquitted of gross negligence manslaughter, even though he'd already admitted at the inquest that he was responsible for what happened to cause the deaths of those people. So the legal bar is very, very high. It's unlikely that there'll be individuals who are successfully prosecuted. The fourth way in which there may be kind of successful legal action in relation to Grenfell is through a class action, an action by some of the affected communities to seek compensation, civil damages against some of the companies involved. This was launched in the United States this summer, I think June 2019. The action is against two companies, Arconic and Celotex. These are the companies that made the flammable cladding, which made the tower such an inferno. And also against Whirlpool. Whirlpool was the manufacturer of the fridge freezer. It was a plastic-backed fridge freezer where the fire began in a fourth-floor flat, which eventually spread so quickly throughout the fire. Whirlpool had plastic-backed fridge freezers on the market, despite calls for plastic-backed white goods to be banned, for them to be metal backed, because of course they're less flammable. But Whirlpool, along with many other major manufacturers, had resisted that change. So there are various ways, in principle at least, there have been various ways related to the powerless, the usual suspects in which the laws works already, and there are ways in which, in relation to the powerful, the criminal justice system may work to bring them to account. It will take a long time, and I suspect in most cases that bringing to account is pretty unlikely. If we move now from Grenfell Tower as a place of crime to Grenfell as a source of harm, since the fire occurred, as a kind of academic, and I've basically been kind of collating evidence of the various kinds of harms that have been produced by the fire upon the affected community, harms of different kinds of dimensions. And I just want to talk about 5 of those dimensions very, very briefly here. Before I do so, I just want to kind of make the point that the important thing about these harms is that they persist, they continue. Some of them, indeed most of them, will be felt by those affected by them for the rest of their lives. These harms will change their lives irrevocably and for the worse. So we tend to think of something like the Grenfell Tower atrocity fire as an event. It's now 2.5 years ago. On one level, that's correct, right? On another level, if you think of the fire as a source of harm, you realise that the harms persist through people's lives, and indeed through the lives of people who weren't in and around the tower at the time. And I'll kind of underscore those points as I go through these 5 dimensions very quickly. So the first kind of form of harm produced by the fire are physical harms, obviously. So we know that there were 72 deaths. Initially, there was a lot of controversy about the numbers of deaths, but the official figure is 72, and of course, that's a very significant death toll. At the same time, there are a whole significant and untold known number of physical injuries associated with the fire, some of which people have recovered from now, some of which will cause them problems throughout the rest of their life. We also know there were significant ill health effects produced by what happened on that night and in its aftermath. So people will suffer for the rest of their lives as a result of smoke inhalation. We know that hydrogen cyanide was released by the panels. That hydrogen cyanide used to be associated with chemical warfare. That has severe detrimental health effects. And we also know that asbestos was released that night and was spread in and around the community. And of course, asbestos is a non-curable cancer-causing agent. So none of these deaths and harms will ever be counted, but we know they've been produced and people will live with them for the rest of their lives. So there are a whole series of physical effects, most of which are not quantifiable, but which we can kind of know about. Secondly, after the physical effects, there are also a whole range of psychological and emotional harms and traumas experienced experienced as a result of the fire on that night. Again, with which many people will live for the rest of their lives. These kind of harms are widely spread. So they're harms felt, of course, by survivors. And if you look at testimonies of survivors, very similar things continually crop up. So people, of course, express grief at loss, mostly grief at loss of people, but also of possessions that can't be replaced, of pets, of photographs. Many of these people came to live in the UK not having been born here. Harms, traumas produced by the horrors of what they saw and experienced that night, trying to get out of the tower or seeing people trying to get out of the tower. People feeling guilt at surviving. Why did I survive when my husband, my lover, my wife, my child, my neighbour, my friend didn't when they were killed? Again, that guilt will live with many people for the rest of their lives. And also, and particularly crassly, these people survive. We're talking about people now who survived the fire in a tower block. And what did the council do and the TMO do? They rehoused them in emergency or temporary accommodation, often which lasted for up to 2 years, by the way. It wasn't so temporary. They rehoused them in other high-rise tower blocks, which again, in a sense, exacerbated the trauma which had been caused by escaping a fire in a tower block, particularly unthinking and uncaring. Psychological harms have also been felt by the wider community, people who weren't in and around the tower that night, because if you know that area of West London or if you've seen it on television, you'll know that the tower stands out and can be seen for miles around. And for almost a year, the tower was just a charred kind of hulk. It wasn't touched. It was, in a sense, a crime scene. And members of the community talking about it as being the crematorium or the coffin in the sky. They refer to the fact that on windy days, they worried about the ashes of their friends, their neighbours, their relatives, their loved ones being blown across the local vicinity. That tower's now wrapped in white linen. It has a green heart on it. So, of course, it looks much more humane, but it's still a constant reminder of the trauma of that night and produces trauma in the community. And the other set of harms we might refer to, excuse me, and this is to take us back to the beginning and the Bolton Cube and find the student accommodation and so on, is the anxiety and the trauma produced for communities around the country, and indeed around the world, who've discovered that they live in tower blocks with the same or similar cladding, but who haven't yet, 2.5 years later, had that cladding removed, and many of whom don't even know when the start date of that removal is. So they go to bed every night worrying that they may be the next victims of something like the fire which occurred at Grenfell Tower in June 2017. Thirdly, much more briefly, I think we can refer to cultural harms. And by cultural harms produced by the fire, I mean literally culture, people's accustomed ways of living being torn apart by the consequence of the events that night. And in particular, I mean by people being relocated. They had to be relocated from their houses, 204 households in the tower, 161 households around the tower. But in that relocation, people's networks, they're kind of, the way they lived their lives were kind of torn apart immediately like that, right? So, the kind of the stuff that makes life worth living, the people you see and just say hello to or chat to or nod to on the bus or on the way to work, or you pass on the street, or you see in the pub or the cafe or the shop or the park, just all those small interactions. People were taken out of those immediately, probably those networks, probably at a time when they needed them most, right? When they were most traumatized, felt at their lowest. They were relocated somewhere else amongst strangers. And in that relocation, they were moved for the most part to temporary or emergency accommodation, by which I mean hotels or bed and breakfasts. And there were lots of testimonies of, people spent months and in some cases years in those places, never knowing when they'd be relocated, right? That's important to know. Never knowing what would happen the next day. Would the next day be the day the council or TMO said, we have somewhere for you to live permanently? So there are lots of testimonies of what it felt like to be in those places. Here's one from a Lebanese woman. It's just a short quote. This is just 3 months after the fire, remember, and a couple of people there for a couple of years. She said this: "I've no complaint about the hotel. When I leave, I'll write a nice letter to thank them. If I had peace of mind, I'd stay happily. But we don't know what's happening. I spend most days sitting in the hotel reception waiting, doing nothing, looking at an iPad, watching cooking programs, just to keep my mind going. I mind not being able to open the window in my room or cook my own food and not having my privacy. But most of all, I mind the long uncertainty. Those people just kind of that were stuck. They kind of felt abandoned, I think. Fourthly, there were a whole series of financial and economic harms produced by the fire, again, which kind of have gone under the radar, but we need to recognise. Households were hit financially. They had to have new and longer journeys to school or to work, which cost them money. They had to take time off work to go to meetings, to go to funerals, to go to health appointments, to go to counselling. They had to replace goods, right? Now, some of these things would be compensatable. Some of them won't be compensatable, but nevertheless, people who were affected by the fire took a financial hit. There were costs to the local economy. Small businesses in and around the area shut down because this became a disaster zone where there was no footfall and where there was no free automatic public access. There were costs to the council, right? Costs of some clean-up, some local costs now through legal costs, through the public inquiry, and those costs to the council will ultimately be paid for by local taxpayers, and the local taxpayers who will be hardest hit by increased council tax or reduced services will be the poorest people in the borough. Those kind of people who lived in Grenfell Tower. And of course, there are costs across other local authorities and the public sector of eventually replacing flammable cladding where it's been found to be the same as or resemble that that wrapped the tower at Grenfell. The last set of harms I want to refer to kind of takes us back to the point I raised at the very beginning about the context of contemptuous relationships within the borough. So the last set of harms are kind of the most esoteric, but in a way, some ways the most significant, I think. And these are what I called harms of recognition. Now, the idea of recognition or harms of recognition comes from a feminist social scientist called Nancy Fraser. And she said that harms of recognition are harms which result when people are denied love, they're denied respect, they're denied dignity. In other words, they're not recognised as fully human. And I think in some ways, it was harms of recognition that produced the fire. Those warnings by the Grenfell Action Group, KCTMO playing with fire, they weren't listened to, right? But those harms of recognition have been reproduced by the way in which the affected community and the survivors have been treated in the aftermath of the fire. So I would argue there are many, many kind of instances of that, I think. The failures of the local and national state to respond after the fire. When the fire happened, the emergency services were there. And then the kind of support for local people was arranged by local people. It was literally the local community. It was voluntary organisations, faith-based and church organisations. The council was absent. Central government was absent to the extent that 9 days after the fire, Theresa May, then Prime Minister, stood up in Parliament and she apologised, and I quote, for the absence of the national and local state when people needed them most. Nothing happened. Those people were just left in a limbo. There's also contempt and harms of recognition generated by the whole series of lies, half-truths, broken promises and delays that have been given to the local community, to the affected community around, when you'll be rehoused, those dates of rehousing and permanent rehousing, those kind of promises just kept shifting back and shifting back and shifting back. Promises about local people being involved in who chaired the public inquiry, how the public inquiry was set up. They were promises that were simply broken. Promises made to local people who had relatives in the area, or indeed who then themselves didn't have papers or didn't have the legal right to remain in the UK. The Home Office said there'd be an amnesty for those people. The amnesty never fully materialised. Those lies, and some of those people have been repatriated or deported to their home countries. So again, the Home Office was also guilty of lying to local residents, and also lies by central government to other local authorities around the country about removing the flammable cladding on high-rise blocks across the country, right, which had been identified. So originally, the government, Sajid Javid, the Minister for Local Communities, Local Government, said that money would be no object. Central government would fund that removal of cladding, but of course money has been an object, which is why, for the most part, that cladding hasn't been removed from high-rise blocks, and people up and down the country still live in fear. So, in a whole series of respects, then, harms which are kind of almost invisible, go below the radar, affecting people's lives in and around Grenfell, but again beyond Grenfell, which we somehow, I think, we have a duty to take account of and to document that. And I'll come back to that at the very end of what I want to say. But having said something about Grenfell as a site of crime, and then in more greater length, something about Grenfell as a site of source of social harm. I want to say finally something about Grenfell as a site of social murder. I'll do this much more briefly. Social murder. Now, by calling Grenfell social murder, we're immediately saying that it wasn't an accident and it wasn't an avoidable tragedy. Yeah? And social murder as a term was coined 150 years ago by a German social scientist called Friedrich Engels. You may not have heard of Engels, but you might recall that Engels was a kind of writing colleague and a close friend, in fact, of somebody called Karl Marx, and you probably would have heard of Karl Marx. They often wrote together, and they wrote the Communist Manifesto together. In 1845, Friedrich Engels, hard to say, published a book based upon a study in Manchester, and it was called The Conditions of the Working Class in England, 1845. And what Engels did was to describe the conditions of living and working in a rapidly industrialising town such as Manchester, early days of capitalism, right? Cotton and textile mills and so on. Described the living and working conditions of the working class, or what he called the proletariat. And he coined the term social murder in this way. And I'll just read out a brief quote. It would be better, of course, it was on the PowerPoint, but hey-ho, it's not there. So let me just bear with me while I read it out. He says, we understand murder. Murder takes place on an interpersonal basis when one person does something to another and they kill somebody. And we still understand murder in that way. But he says this: when society places hundreds of proletarians, working class people, in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, when society deprives thousands of people of the necessities of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is inevitable, its deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of the single individual is murder. In other words, he's saying, look, if society or social institutions leave people in conditions where they know that it's likely, indeed inevitable, that some bad stuff will happen, which results in their lives being cut short, then that society and those social institutions are guilty of murder just as much as the individual murderer. Now, when you hear those words, I'd invite you to think back to the KCTMO Playing with Fire blog by the Grenfell Action Group 7 months before the fire, which says, if you leave us in these conditions, there will be a multi-fatality atrocity. Yeah? Tells me that what we have at Grenfell was a source of social harm, was a crime, but also was a social murder. Okay, I'm just going to kind of wrap up now, if you bear with me for a minute or two. So we can think about and talk about Grenfell as crime, Grenfell as harm, Grenfell as social murder, but then where does this leave us? And in particular, where does this leave us in terms of justice, what justice looks like for the victims, for the bereaved, and for the wider affected community? And I want to make 3 points here. First of all, part of justice, we need the truth. We need the truth about what happened and why it happened. Why what happened. We need to know what produced the atrocity. And we also need to know about the consequences of that, the harms that are generated since. So there's a public inquiry now under Sir Martin Moore-Bick. It began its work in June 2018. It's currently in a year's recession. It will formally kick in again in around January 2020. It's expected to report 2021, 2022. So it's a long process. It will cost a lot of money. But that public inquiry can only at best partly deliver the truth. It's not going to, for example, it will track some of the immediate prior conditions to causing the fire. But it won't track public policy before the fire. It won't track contemptuous relationships before the fire. It won't track the ignoring of warnings before the fire. And it won't track all of the harms produced since the fire. So here, I think, in terms of generating truth, there's a role for campaigners, there's a role for investigative journalists, and dare I say it, there's a role, I think, for academic researchers. So justice means truth. It also means accountability. It means the guilty men, the guilty women, and the guilty organisations, remember caught up in manslaughter, the guilty organisations as well, must be held legally accountable as appropriate, as the law allows. Having said that, as I indicated earlier on, in this respect, in terms of holding the guilty to account, past experience of holding the powerful to account tells us that we shouldn't hold that much hope. We should be much more sceptical about the ability of the criminal justice system to deal with the powerful in the ways that it can deal with the usual suspects, as I mentioned earlier on. So justice, thirdly, requires truth and it requires accountability, but it's also something else. I think it's something else, and this comes from not from my experience of working with the Grenfell survivors, because I haven't directly, but I have worked with families bereaved by workplace deaths for 30 years and so on, for a long time, many families. And of course, they want different things, and I'm not speaking for them, but one common thread that comes through working with those families is this. They say that out of this death, out of this atrocity, out of losing my loved one, we want to make sure the lessons are learned so that other families don't go through what we have gone through and continue to go through. Yeah. No more families should experience these forms of atrocity. No more families should experience very high profile and indeed low profile forms of social murder. We often hear about lessons being learnt, but these families really do want lessons to be learned. And those lessons require whole-scale social change and new forms of social justice, which can't be delivered through the criminal justice system. Truth, justice, accountability. Okay. Thank you very much for joining me and listening to me and having to put on my face and not the overheads. I appreciate that. And in joining me and listening, thank you very much for supporting our industrial action. As I said earlier on, it's our action, but good working conditions for all university staff mean good conditions for learning. Next up on the Alternative University of the Air, log in at 2:00 for my amazing colleague Casey Mahendran. Casey's going to be speaking about race, representation and European imperialism as these affect or perhaps infect higher education. Till then, thank you very much. Goodbye.